I'm Daksh. I'm one of the co-founders of Greptile. We do AI that reviews pull requests for software teams and helps them catch bugs and enforce standards in their code base. At some point, in senior year, I kind of realized that I'd lost my way, and I had, the whole reason I decided to study computer science and engineering was that I wanted to build things. And I got introduced through my now co-founder Sahun, who I met in college, that there was this entire world in Silicon Valley where people just invented things, and that was what they did for a living. And it just seemed like this crazy magical place. And so after school, I convinced my third co-founder, who was my roommate in college, smartest person I know, Vaishant, to come out to San Francisco. And we didn't have very clear goals in mind. We just knew we wanted to build useful things, and we were lucky enough that an angel investor at Georgia Tech gave us a little bit of money so we could live off of it, and that was sort of the starting point. And this is about just over 2 years ago now. Time and time again, it seemed like the problem that they were facing after their often small organizations had strongly developed and started using AI coding tools was their new bottleneck was code review. They just had too much code to review. And it seems to us that that could be an interesting path where we could build an AI code reviewer that brought the same power that people were using to develop software to validating it, which in some sense is equally valuable. Again, at a commercial software organization, producing the code is completely not valuable if you're not validating the code as well. And so building tools for that seemed like a very compelling path forward that would have some tailwinds to carry us. We treat all software as alpha in some sense, where everything that we introduce, if it's the correct piece of software, the correct tools, not to get too meta on this, but when people talk about the core difference between sort of human productivity versus the productivity of any other species, most of the delta comes from the usage of tools. And on the margin, slightly better tools can create long-term efficiencies in the company. They can open up more time for all kinds of much more important things and much more business critical things. And so we're generally good about adopting modern software. And on the project management side, engineering uses Linear. We all use Claude Code. Many of us use Cursor. And we use Claude Code not only for programming, but for just all kinds of automations. We use it for running queries against our code base, our database. We use it to sort of do automatically do like security questionnaires for customers, for instance. And of course, for our back office operations, the same thing. We've been using Parallel for bookkeeping. And then one of the first of this category of tools that we adopted was of course Warp, which we brought in right when it was time for us to start doing real payroll and compliant payroll, when that became important, which was when we made our very first hire. We decided to adopt it. The references for Warp were incredibly strong. Everyone that we heard using Warp talked about it with the type of passion that you wouldn't think people would talk about back office software with, and it just seemed so out of the ordinary. It's and there's very few companies have that distinction where it's how people talk about Ramp or people talk about actually, off the top of my head, I can't even think of too many other examples of people talking like passionately about back office software. I think that it's rare for this much attention to detail and go into software that isn't sort of a consumer software or isn't software that people live in. The incredible thing about Warp is that because it's so heavily automated, I'm never in it. And of course now we have an ops person, but I don't think she's really in it that much either. And yet, like, the times that you're in it, it is very nice. It's a very good experience, and I really like keyboard shortcuts a lot, and Warp is sort of littered with keyboard shortcuts. In some sense, you can kind of tell it was made with uniquely tasteful engineers, and the engineer part being critical there too, because there's a lot of the data model makes sense. I think a lot of other payroll providers are made for HR people. And they're made where you have maybe a lot of levers available to you, and they're available to you sort of all at once. And for someone that's familiar with HR software, they will have a relatively easy time navigating a lot of these other platforms. But for folks that don't have that background, and I'm not an HR person, never been an HR person, Warp makes a ton more sense. When you go in and you're like, okay, the thing I want to do is I want to give someone a raise. And well, I will click on their profile, and then one of their attributes is going to be what their pay is, and I just click on that and I change the number. It's extremely intuitive. Yeah. And it's one of those things where when you're used to confusing software, simple things like this are just like really delightful to use. One of the things that I like about Warp, and like I've said, is I don't have to be in it a lot. And then sort of a consequence of that is I actually don't know exactly what would need to change and what would need to improve. I think that something that I found very interesting too is because I'm not a HR or payroll expert, I actually don't know what exactly is going to go wrong with our HR way of doing things as we scale from 15 to 20 to 30 people. But what I suspect is that whatever it is that will go wrong, Warp will have some functionality for it. Like I suspect that there's going to be a point in the future where SSO is going to become much more important, where we're going to need better ways of doing PTO. We're going to have some sort of enforced PTO policy. I don't know yet, but we don't track PTOs yet. I'm sure we will need to soon.
I think you're at a point where you'll probably want to start tracking.
Right, the good thing about this is that I'm like, oh, we need to track PTO, and I'll go and magically somehow, I've never noticed before, but there's going to be a button for PTO somewhere, and I'll click on it, and then we'll start tracking PTO. One thing that we do differently, at least from other startups, is, and I think is quite unusual, is at least on the engineering side, and to some degree on the go-to-market side, we've hired more senior than is typical. When you picture a Silicon Valley startup, you picture everyone's about 19, 20, 21 years old, and maybe they've dropped out of college, maybe they're new graduates. We have sort of pressed on hiring more experienced people. Actually, a couple of reasons for this. I think one, there is sort of an ageism in Silicon Valley that we're sort of arbitraging, where people underestimate the value of experience. And second, my co-founders and I, the strengths that we bring are we're new graduates. We have no preconceived notions around any of these things, and it allows us to be more inventive. And we have very, very high energy, and we have very little outside of work, and we can really like pour our lives into this. What we don't have is the scar tissue from 10 years of building at-scale engineering systems. One of our goals for the first year of the company was we want to build an organization that is, again, a compelling opportunity for someone who can go anywhere. And that is true for all of the people that we've hired. They've all had fantastic careers at great companies. They could go and work anywhere. And we have worked hard to build a company that is worthy of their time. And the decision to spend your 20s or your 30s, a large part of your professional life working at a company and spending this much time on it is a very large decision. We consider that a sort of high gravity decision. We were sort of unusual in that we hadn't gotten into YC or even raised a significant amount of funding going into San Francisco and moving to Silicon Valley. We had just enough that we could survive a few months, and it turns out it was shorter months because we didn't really know how much more expensive San Francisco is than Atlanta, where we'd come from. And we moved here moved into sort of this really terrible Airbnb, and just built things that we thought would be useful for people like us. For us, that meant we wanted to build AI tools that would help programmers program. We were programmers, that was helpful for us. And we built these. We went to a hackathon where we built the first version of a chat with your code base tool. A lot of the technology from that today is what kind of makes Greptile very different from its competitors and is a core part of our infrastructure. And at that hackathon, we decided to apply to YC. The hackathon was hosted by Scale AI, which is one of the great YC companies of the last decade. And YC has sort of obviously a strong hold on Silicon Valley culture. You're one day of hacking with your friends away from creating some nugget of value. We started using Warp because we heard about it on Twitter, and we saw all these people talking about how amazing it is. And the words people were using were crazy. People were saying, Warp has changed my life. Warp is the most amazing piece of software I've ever used. And we're like, oh, this must be like some crazy like programming tool or something. And then we clicked on it. It was like, it's payroll? Like, why are people so excited about payroll? That seems very strange. And then I started using it, and I was like, okay, I can see this, because it's like, if you're always used to payroll, which takes up a bunch of your time, and as a founder, you're not supposed to spend a bunch of time on payroll. You're supposed to spend time making your product better and making your customers happier. And I think that's what Warp in some sense enables, where you turn it on and the automations are thoughtful, and it scales nicely, and you know that people like it. It's obviously honestly very strangely high signal for a category of software that isn't typically something that people feel so strongly and passionately about. And I think that was very evident when we started using it. There was taste in how it was built. There was sort of very intuitive to use, even for a person that has never used HR software before. I suspect it's also very intuitive for people that have used HR software before. And overall, just one of those things where it really, not to sort of overstate the thing, but it kind of inspires you to build more intuitive things and put care into things which you don't even think people will spend a lot of time in. We don't spend a lot of time in the inside of Warp by design, and the little time we spend is good.